The international community might be sleepwalking its way into a global conflict without understanding that there can be no victors in a future world war. That's the view of the Special Envoy for South Africa's candidature for the United Nations Security Council, who's in New York to lobby member states ahead of the elections in June this year. Aziz Pahad, a former Deputy Foreign Minister of the country, says they hope to represent the broad challenges facing Africa and form a stronger link between peace, stability and development. In conversation with our correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease, he also labelled as a mistake South Africa's controversial vote during their last term in the Council in favour of a no-fly zone over Libya.
Aziz Pahad, welcome back to the United Nations and back to New York. What is the main thrust of your argument here this week? You are going to be meeting with the Secretary General, the Africa Group, BRICS countries, the P3. What are you going to tell them about South Africa's bid for the Security Council?
I hope we'll get a chance to talk about the broad African challenges and how, when we're talking of peace and stability and all, how do we then deal with the issue of growing poverty, inequality, unemployment? And as you know, that's a huge challenge, not only for South Africa, but for many other countries in the world.
So you want to make a link between the threats to international peace and security and how resolving those will fuel the achievement of the SDGs, for example?
And as Kofi Annan said when he was the Secretary, you can't have peace without development, and you can't have development without peace. But, you know, it's a correct statement. But we have to look at what did we achieve since that statement was made.
So let me ask you this. You know, South Africa as a government have long complained about the unreformed nature of the Security Council, the decades-long intergovernmental negotiations that have limped from nothing to nowhere, essentially. The hegemony over the 5 permanent members that seems as intractable as the conflict in Syria. Why spend the resources and all this effort to be part of a body you yourselves call undemocratic and have been consistently critical of?
Because we've always had a position, and I think it's a general third world country's position, that the only way to deal with the challenges of the third world and try to get some equality, you'll never get total equality by the big powers and the rest of the world, but to try to get some equality and have the voice of Africa, and I hope we will speak broader when we're in the Security Council, the voice of the poor throughout the world. And that voice, on top of other discussions, if we are able to use our membership to start raising those issues, it's not a Security Council issue, but we can link it to peace and stability. There is a growing understanding that Africa needs to have a permanent seat.
Yes.
The debate is whether the new permanent members will have the veto or not. Whereas in the past we have argued, and we do argue with many other countries, that the veto in 2018 is anachronistic. Mm-hmm. And increasingly, the veto is being used not for peace and stability, sustainable peace and stability, but one power is vetoing it because they don't like.
Right, because of their bilateral interests. And so the UN is set up as a collective body where you want to find consensus, and then countries have this undemocratic tool called the veto. Is South Africa's position still that the veto needs to go away?
Well, our position is distinct for what is called the G4. That's basically India and the other 3 powers that were defeated. Germany, Italy, and Japan.
Right.
They have got a coalition of 4, and they seem to be willing to accept a position in the Security Council without the veto now. Africa, which we are part of, we have to work by the collective decision. You argue for realistic approaches, and if the collective says we want the veto when we go in, that's the position we will argue for.
President Mandela said that human rights would be the cornerstone of a democratic South Africa's foreign policy. But at the Human Rights Council, Special Envoy in Geneva, South Africa often appears to be making common cause with states that have serious question marks around their human rights records in their own countries. Will South Africa be advancing human rights at the forefront of this candidature?
Pre-94, the human rights angle has always been our position. It's in the Freedom Charter in different ways. It's in policy documents. But we tended to understand, maybe we didn't market it sufficiently, that while human rights remains the cornerstone of our policy, it cannot impact on bilateral decisions. And I want to believe that has remained our position. Of course, in these matters, our representatives in the bodies consult, and they have to reflect what's the general thinking, and then we have to also think what is the view within the continent. But I don't really think we shifted decisively from our commitment that human rights must be a major element of our developing foreign policy.
What do you make of the current makeup of the Security Council? What do you see these tensions, particularly over Syria, between the United States and Russia? There's talk about the return of a new Cold War without the safeguards that were there in the 60s. What's your sense of this council that you want to be part of right now?
What you're raising is key. What it's reflecting is that international relations in many ways has changed fundamentally. And there was an element of this in the Cold War days, but it was working itself off because there were two powers balancing themselves. And don't forget, at that time, there were powers that were vetoing on many issues that were coming in. We believe, as I said, that we have to look at this transformed Security Council, and one element is the veto vote. But you're asking the right question. Now that it's some of the regional conflicts are threatening not only regional security but international peace. Now that is the role of the Security Council, to deal with.
Right.
That is the reason for their foundation, actually. I think since 9/11 and subsequent to this, since the Middle East crisis has taken dimensions where some major powers are taking sides in the question, we are in a very dangerous situation. Personally, I think that the international community might be sleepwalking itself to either an accidental or a decision to go to another big power conflict. And if they must understand that another world war is a war that nobody can win. Because of the nuclear proliferation and because all powers have announced major new weapons. So hopefully common sense is going to prevail.
So what will South Africa's common sense then be, given your close relationships with China and Russia, for example, in BRICS? There's a long-standing issue of resentment that the ANC government has held, given the support the United States government gave to certain groups around the world, particularly against the armed struggle. What's your sense of those relationships, and where will South Africa find itself come critical decisions in the Council?
There must be more consultations amongst the emerging powers. And emerging powers are not just China and this Singapore, there's Malaysia, there's South Korea. And, we have to do what we do quite well. We interact with all parties, and then at the end, on the basis of that, we have to take our own national interest. But it's not a narrow national interest. It's a national interest for the common good. And on the basis of that, hopefully we and the other non-permanent members can now begin to play a role that goes beyond just being a member of the Security Council. And I do want to believe that our previous membership of the Security Council, maybe not in the public aspect and maybe not impacting on the big powers' tendency sometimes to politicize, everything is political in a sense, but over-politicize issues, overshadowed what South Africa and none other permanent members can achieve in the security. But it's difficult.
This is going to be a tough question for you because you're not in government anymore, right? And people need to understand that. But the big controversial decision during South Africa's last term in the council was Resolution 1973 that created the no-fly zone over Libya. The intention from the South African government's perspective was to protect civilians. They felt that NATO went too far. You know the story, the criticism that emanated out of South Africa, and particularly from other African countries. What lessons has South Africa learned from that decision?
Well, my own view was that once that clause was inserted by any means, then we should have expected that resolution, outside of that it was quite an innocent resolution, but they had already been building up to a regime change in Libya. There was already a momentum. And once that clause was inserted, you had to then expect.
So it was a bad decision in your view?
I think understanding that people expected that nobody would take such a silly decision, I think in the end we can say that could be seen as one of our, mistakes.
So what are the lessons that you learned from that mistake moving into council again?
The lessons are that, as we did, and we always do, is you continue to argue on the dangers of any such actions. And our principal position, which is in the Freedom Charter, you must try to resolve conflicts by dialogue and discussions. And it hints that we should be opposed to regime change now. Regime change has not succeeded to bring democracy anywhere. It has only succeeded to destabilize countries more and create conditions for worse tyrants and dictators to come into power.
Will that decision hurt the popularity of South Africa's candidature? African countries have been critical. Mugabe, when he was in power, was very critical and pointed in his criticism of that vote. Will that hurt the number of African countries supporting you in this bid?
At the moment, we are the only candidates, and we have the unanimous African support. I think since then, the AU had an excellent plan of trying to intervene, and I think they had got quite far by convincing Gaddafi to take the soft landing option and to leave and prevent that what has happened since then. I want to hope that people don't see us just in terms of one or two wrong decisions.
Let me ask you a final question. South Africa will be marking, and the world certainly, the centenary of Nelson Mandela's birth. We are running for the Security Council. We are currently the chairpersons of BRICS and SADC. What should we, or South Africans, think about this moment?
Well, it is Madiba's 100th anniversary, and we celebrate in Madiba and Albertina Sisulu.
Right.
And it's important to keep the two. They had different strengths to bring into and different contributions. I think it just coincided that we are going for the non-permanent seat. It's fallen on our shoulders to be chair of SADC and at the same time to be chair of BRICS. So that is quite a lot of pressure on our diplomats and the new minister. And I hope if we see it as challenges, we must work at it not just as DIRCO, but as the common good. South Africa as what do we call it? I don't use a business term, but work with all South African NGOs, universities, experts, and work together to help us now go through what is probably the most complex and complicated period in international relations.
Problem solved. Aziz Pahad, thank you.